Right now, as you're listening to this, something is flowing through your veins that might not supposed to be there. Not a disease, not a virus, something far stranger. A genetic marker that 85% of humans carry, but 15% don't, and nobody can fully explain why. Here's the thing that keeps biologists up at night. When they map human blood types, everything makes sense. A, B, O, the different combinations, it all traces back through evolution in neat, predictable patterns. Except for one thing, the Rh factor. Or more specifically, the absence of it. If you're Rh negative, you're missing a protein that's found in every other primate on Earth. Chimpanzees have it. Gorillas have it. Orangutans have it. Every monkey, every ape, they all carry the Rh protein. It's been part of primate blood for millions of years, passed down through countless generations like a genetic heirloom. But then there's you, walking around without it, like someone deleted a piece of code that was supposed to be fundamental to primate biology. Now you might think, okay, so some people don't have a protein. Big deal. Genetic variation happens all the time. Except this isn't normal variation. This is genetic negative. It's not a mutation that added something new. It's the absence of something ancient, something that should be there. And when you dig into the numbers, the mystery gets even deeper. Roughly 15% of the global population is Rh negative. But that distribution isn't even. Not even close. In Asia, Rh negative blood is almost non-existent. Less than 1% in some populations. In Africa, the continent where humanity originated, it's equally rare. But in Europe, suddenly the numbers jump. 15 to 20% in most populations, and then you get to the Basque people, living in the mountains between Spain and France, and 30 to 35% of them are Rh negative, the highest concentration anywhere on Earth. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I love checking the comments. Tokyo at sunrise, Texas at midnight, all exploring the same mystery at once. Here's where it gets really strange. When scientists try to trace Rh negative blood back through human history, the trail goes cold. It doesn't follow the normal patterns of genetic inheritance. It appears suddenly in the archaeological record, clusters in specific populations, and defies the mathematical models that work for literally every other human trait. Some researchers have suggested it's a random mutation that happened in Europe and spread through isolated populations. But random mutations don't usually delete ancient genetic code. They add to it, modify it, sure, but completely remove a protein that's been part of primate DNA for 25 million years. That's not how evolution typically works. Others point to the medical paradox that we'll explore deeper later. Rh negative mothers can literally reject their own Rh positive babies. The mother's body treats the child like a foreign invader, creating antibodies to attack it. This is called hemolytic disease, and before modern medicine it killed countless infants. From an evolutionary standpoint, this is insane. A trait that makes reproduction more dangerous should have been eliminated from the gene pool millions of years ago. Instead, it persists. It thrives in certain populations. It concentrates in bloodlines that trace back to some of the oldest cultures in Europe. And then there are the theories that exist in the shadows of mainstream science. Ancient texts speaking of bloodlines that descended from the gods. Royal families obsessed with keeping their blood pure. Mystery schools and secret societies that allegedly knew something about Rh negative blood that's been hidden for thousands of years. Stories of Atlantis, of the Nephilim, of visitors from the stars who left something in our genetic code. We're going to explore all of it. The science, the history, the theories that make academics uncomfortable, and the possibilities that challenge everything we think we know about where we came from. Because somewhere in your blood there might be a code, a message, an answer to a question humanity has been asking since we first looked up at the stars and wondered if we're alone. Before we dive deeper into why Rh negative blood is so strange, so anomalous, so utterly mysterious, we need to understand what blood types actually are. Because most people walk around knowing their blood type is A positive or O negative without having any idea what that actually means. And once you understand the science, the mystery becomes even more profound. Let's start with the basics, the ABO blood group system. This is the fundamental classification that divides all human blood into 4 main categories: A, B, AB, and O. Simple enough, right? But here's what those letters actually represent. They're describing specific proteins called antigens that sit on the surface of your red blood cells. Think of antigens as identity markers, molecular flags that tell your immune system, this cell belongs here, this is part of me, don't attack it. If you have type A blood, your red blood cells are covered with A antigens. Type B blood has B antigens. Type AB has both A and B antigens on the same cells. And type O, the most common blood type worldwide, has neither A nor B antigens, just bare red blood cells without these specific markers. Now your body isn't stupid. It knows what antigens it's supposed to have, and it creates antibodies against any antigens it doesn't have. This is crucial. If you're type A, your immune system produces antibodies against type B blood, your body would recognize type B antigens as foreign invaders and attack them viciously. This is why blood transfusions can be deadly if the types don't match. You're not just mixing fluids. You're introducing cells with foreign identity markers into a system that's programmed to destroy anything it doesn't recognize. Type O blood is called the universal donor because it has no A or B antigens, nothing for the recipient's immune system to attack. Type AB is the universal recipient because people with AB blood don't produce antibodies against either A or B antigens. Their immune systems recognize both as friendly. But this is just the first layer. The ABO system is relatively straightforward, discovered in 1901 by Karl Landsteiner, who basically invented the concept of blood types. He noticed that mixing blood from different people sometimes caused violent clumping reactions and sometimes didn't. Within a few years, he'd worked out the AB-ABO classification that's still used today. Then in 1940, things got more complicated. Landsteiner and his colleague Alexander Wiener were doing research with rhesus monkeys. They were injecting monkey blood into rabbits and guinea pigs to study immune responses, and they discovered something unexpected. The rabbit immune systems were producing antibodies against a protein that appeared on the surface of rhesus monkey red blood cells. When they tested human blood, they found that about 85% of people had this same protein. The other 15% didn't have it at all. They called this the rhesus factor, after the monkeys they'd been studying, Rh for short. If you have the protein, you're Rh positive. If you don't, you're Rh negative. Add this to the ABO system and you get the 8 main blood types we're familiar with. A positive, A negative, B positive, B negative, AB positive, AB negative, O positive, O negative. Now here's where genetics come in. Blood type isn't random. It's inherited through specific genetic markers passed down from your parents. The ABO genes sit on chromosome 9. You get 1 copy from your mother, 1 from your father. The A and B genes are co-dominant, meaning if you inherit 1 of each, you express both, giving you type AB blood. The O gene is recessive, meaning you need 2 copies, 1 from each parent, to have type O blood. If you inherit 1 A gene and 1 O gene, you'll be type A, but you're carrying that hidden O gene that could be passed to your children. The Rh factor works similarly, but sits on a completely different chromosome, chromosome 1. The gene that produces the Rh protein is dominant. This means you only need 1 copy from either parent to be Rh positive. To be Rh negative, you need to inherit 2 copies of the recessive non-Rh gene, 1 from each parent. Both your parents have to either be Rh negative themselves or be Rh-positive carriers of the recessive gene. This is standard genetics, basic Mendelian inheritance, nothing unusual so far, except there's a problem, a big one. When we map out the distribution of Rh-negative blood around the world, the patterns don't make sense, not from an evolutionary perspective, not from a population genetics perspective, not from any conventional scientific framework. In most of the world, Rh-negative blood is extremely rare. In Asia, less than 1% of the population is Rh-negative. In Africa, it's around 3%. Among indigenous populations in the Americas, it's virtually non-existent. Some Native American tribes have 0 documented cases of Rh-negative blood. None. In a population of millions across thousands of years, this genetic variant simply isn't present. But in Europe, suddenly 15 to 20% of the population is Rh-negative. In some regions, it's even higher. Among the Basque people of northern Spain and southern France, up to 35% are Rh-negative. More than 1 in 3. This is not normal genetic distribution. This is not what you'd expect from a random mutation spreading through populations over time. Here's why this matters. In evolutionary biology, there's a principle called negative selection. Traits that reduce survival or reproduction get weeded out over time. They don't stick around. They definitely don't spread to significant portions of the population, and Rh-negative blood has a massive evolutionary disadvantage built right into it. It's called hemolytic disease of the newborn, and we'll get into the horrifying details in the next section. But the short version is this. When an Rh-negative mother carries an Rh-positive baby, her immune system can attack the fetus as if it were a foreign invader. Without modern medical intervention, this condition killed enormous numbers of babies throughout human history. Second pregnancies, third pregnancies, the danger increased with each child. Any genetic trait that causes mothers to attack their own babies should have been eliminated from the gene pool tens of thousands of years ago. It's one of the strongest possible selection pressures. Women with this trait would have fewer surviving children. Their genetic lines would dwindle and disappear. Yet Rh-negative blood isn't disappearing. In some populations, it's thriving. This shouldn't be possible. Not according to standard evolutionary theory. Not unless Rh-negative blood came with some massive survival advantage that offset the reproductive disadvantage. Some benefit so profound that it was worth losing babies to keep this trait in the population. But here's the thing. Nobody has found that advantage. Decades of research, thousands of studies, and the scientific community still can't explain what evolutionary benefit Rh-negative blood provides. There are theories, educated guesses, but nothing conclusive. Nothing that fully explains why this trait exists, why it's concentrated in specific populations, why it hasn't been selected out of existence. And it gets stranger. The Rh protein itself, the thing that Rh-positive people have and Rh-negative people lack, isn't some minor molecular detail. It's a complex protein that plays important roles in maintaining red blood cell structure and possibly in transporting gases across cell membranes. Most mammals have it. Primates have it. Our evolutionary ancestors had it. The genetic evidence suggests that having the Rh protein is the ancient original condition, the default setting for human blood going back millions of years, which means Rh-negative blood isn't just rare, it represents a deletion, a loss of genetic information that most of the human family tree possesses. Somehow, somewhere in our past, a group of humans lost the ability to produce this protein, and instead of dying out, they thrived. At least in certain parts of the world, they thrived so successfully that their descendants now number in the hundreds of millions. This is where the scientific explanations start getting uncomfortable, where mainstream genetics runs into questions it can't quite answer. Population bottlenecks can sometimes preserve unusual genetic variants through pure chance. Small, isolated populations can develop unique traits through genetic drift. These are real phenomena, documented and understood, but they don't fully explain the Rh-negative distribution pattern. They don't explain why it's so common in Europe and so rare everywhere else. They don't explain why it persists despite the massive reproductive disadvantage. Some researchers suggest that Rh-negative blood might have provided resistance to certain diseases, parasites that were common in ancient Europe but rare in other parts of the world. Maybe, but nobody has found definitive evidence. Others propose that Rh-negative individuals might have had some cognitive or physical advantage, some trait that made them more successful despite the pregnancy complications. Again, maybe, but the data isn't there. What we're left with is a mystery wrapped in science. A genetic trait that violates the normal rules of evolutionary selection, concentrated in specific populations for reasons we don't fully understand, causing medical complications that should have eliminated it from the gene pool millennia ago. The science can describe what Rh-negative blood is, how it's inherited, what proteins are present or absent, but it struggles to explain why. Why does this exist? Where did it come from? And why, despite everything working against it, has it survived? These are the questions that open the door to alternative theories, to ideas that sit outside mainstream science, to possibilities that sound like science fiction until you realize that the conventional explanations aren't actually explaining anything. They're just describing the mystery in increasingly technical language. When the science can't answer the basic question of origin, when the evolutionary math doesn't add up, that's when people start looking for other answers. And some of those answers, as we're about to explore, are far stranger than anything you'd find in a genetics textbook. Here's where things get really disturbing. Not ancient history disturbing, not theoretical disturbing. Immediate, measurable, happening in hospitals right now disturbing. Because Rh-negative blood doesn't just sit there being unusual, it actively tries to destroy Rh-positive life. Let me explain what happens when an Rh-negative woman becomes pregnant with an Rh-positive baby. And trust me, this is where the mystery stops being academic and starts being visceral. The first pregnancy usually goes fine. The mother's immune system doesn't know anything unusual is happening. Her blood and the baby's blood remain separated by the placental barrier. Two different circulatory systems, no mixing, no problems. She carries the baby to term, delivers, everything seems normal. But during delivery something happens. Birth is messy. Blood mixes. Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's just a few cells, but it's enough. The mother's immune system, which has been quietly doing its job for 9 months, suddenly encounters something it's never seen before. Rh-positive blood cells, cells that carry the D antigen, cells that, to her immune system, look exactly like foreign invaders. And her body responds the way it's supposed to respond to foreign invaders. It attacks. Within days, her immune system has memorized the shape of that D antigen. It's created antibodies specifically designed to target and destroy anything carrying that protein. It's marked Rh-positive blood as the enemy, forever. This is called sensitization, and it's permanent. Once an Rh-negative mother has been sensitized to Rh-positive blood, her immune system never forgets. It's locked and loaded, ready to respond instantly if it ever encounters that antigen again. Now she gets pregnant a second time, another Rh-positive baby. But this time, her immune system knows what it's looking for. Those antibodies, small enough to cross the placental barrier, begin flowing into the baby's bloodstream, and they start destroying the baby's blood cells. Systematically, relentlessly. This is called hemolytic disease of the newborn. Hemolytic meaning the destruction of blood cells. The baby's own blood is being attacked by its mother's immune system. Think about how fundamentally wrong this is. Pregnancy is supposed to be the most protected state in nature. Evolution has built thousands of mechanisms to ensure successful reproduction. The placenta is a biological marvel, carefully regulating what passes between mother and child. The maternal immune system is specifically suppressed during pregnancy to prevent rejection of the fetus, which is, after all, carrying foreign DNA from the father. But with Rh incompatibility, all of those protective mechanisms fail. The mother's antibodies slip through the placental barrier like it's not even there. They latch onto the baby's red blood cells and mark them for destruction. The baby's spleen, trying desperately to compensate, goes into overdrive producing new blood cells, but it can't keep up. The baby becomes anemic, severely anemic. Its heart has to pump harder to deliver oxygen with fewer red blood cells. The heart enlarges, struggling under the load. The liver and spleen swell as they try to produce more blood cells and process the debris of the destroyed ones. Fluid begins accumulating in the baby's tissues. This condition is called hydrops fetalis, and before modern medicine it was usually fatal. But even if the baby survives to birth, the crisis isn't over. All those destroyed blood cells break down into bilirubin, a yellow pigment that the baby's immature liver can't process fast enough. Bilirubin levels spike. The baby's skin turns yellow, then orange. This is severe jaundice, and if it's not treated immediately, the bilirubin crosses into the brain. It deposits in the basal ganglia, causing permanent neurological damage, cerebral palsy, hearing loss, developmental delays, or death. This is kernicterus, and it's as terrible as it sounds. For thousands of years, Rh-negative mothers watched their second, third, fourth children die, and nobody knew why. Healthy pregnancies ending in stillbirth or babies that lived for a few days before succumbing to complications that seemed to come from nowhere. It must have seemed like a curse. And in rural communities where Rh-negative blood is more common, it was a curse that happened over and over. The medical establishment didn't even understand what was happening until the 1940s. Researchers finally figured out the mechanism, identified the antibodies, understood the progression. But understanding didn't mean they could stop it. For another 20 years, doctors could diagnose hemolytic disease, but couldn't prevent it. They could do exchange transfusions on newborns, replacing the baby's Rh-positive blood with Rh-negative blood to remove the maternal antibodies. It saved some babies, but it was dangerous, expensive, and traumatic. Then, in the 1960s, researchers developed RhoGAM, an injection of Rh antibodies given to Rh-negative mothers right after delivery. The injected antibodies would destroy any fetal blood cells that had entered the mother's circulation before her own immune system could react. It prevented sensitization. One injection after each pregnancy, and subsequent babies were protected. It was a medical miracle. Within a decade, hemolytic disease of the newborn went from a major cause of infant mortality to a largely preventable condition. But here's the question that should keep you up at night. Why does this mechanism exist at all? Evolution is ruthless, but it's not stupid. Traits that harm reproductive success get eliminated. Fast. A blood type that causes mothers to destroy their own babies should have been selected out of the population millions of years ago. It's the most fundamental evolutionary failure imaginable. Reproduction is the only thing that matters in evolutionary terms. Survive, reproduce, pass on your genes. A trait that interferes with reproduction is evolutionary suicide. Yet Rh-negative blood persists. It's not going away. In some populations, it's the majority blood type. This doesn't make sense, unless Rh-negative blood appeared recently. Too recently for evolution to eliminate it, or unless it appeared suddenly. Not through gradual mutation, but through some other mechanism. Something that introduced an incompatible blood type into the human population all at once. Because here's what makes this even stranger. This kind of blood incompatibility doesn't really exist anywhere else in nature. Sure, different species can't exchange blood, that's obvious, but within a species, members of the same species having immune reactions to each other's blood during reproduction. It's virtually unprecedented. It's like discovering that some humans can't reproduce with other humans without medical intervention. Like we're not quite the same species after all. Two bloodlines that look the same, act the same, but at the molecular level are incompatible. And that raises a question that most scientists won't touch. What if Rh-negative blood isn't a normal human mutation? What if it's evidence of something else, some other origin? Because nature doesn't create blood types that fight against their own children. Not unless something went very, very wrong somewhere in our past. There's a small region nestled in the Pyrenees Mountains where Spain and France meet. Rolling green hills, ancient forests, coastline that's been battered by Atlantic storms for thousands of years. It looks like any other corner of Western Europe, but the people living there are different. Fundamentally, mysteriously, genetically different. They're called the Basques, and they represent one of the most profound biological mysteries in human history. Here's what we know. Among Basque populations, up to 35% carry Rh-negative blood. In some isolated Basque villages, that number climbs even higher, approaching 40%. For context, the global average is around 15%. Even among other European populations, Rh-negative rarely exceeds 20%. But among the Basques, it's not just common, it's dominant. It's like they're a living reservoir of something ancient, something that's been diluted or bred out of almost every other human population on Earth. But the blood is just the beginning. The Basques speak a language called Euskara, and it's unlike anything else in Europe. Not similar to Spanish, not related to French, not connected to any Indo-European language family at all. Linguists have been studying Euskara for centuries, and they cannot find relatives. It doesn't descend from Latin like the Romance languages. It doesn't share roots with Germanic or Slavic tongues. It's not related to the Celtic languages that once dominated Western Europe. It's an isolate, a linguistic island that has no known connections to any other language on the planet. Think about what that means. Every language in Europe, from Portuguese to Russian, from Greek to Norwegian, they're all part of language families. You can trace them back, find common ancestors, map their evolution over thousands of years. But Euskara just sits there, defying every attempt at classification. It's like finding a species of bird that doesn't fit into any known family, genus or order. It exists, but it shouldn't. At least not according to everything we know about how languages evolve and spread. Some linguists have proposed distant connections to languages in the Caucasus Mountains, thousands of miles away. Others have suggested links to ancient Iberian languages that died out before the Romans arrived. But none of these theories have gained wide acceptance because the evidence is too thin, the connections too speculative. The most honest answer linguists can give is that we simply don't know where Euskara came from. It's been there in the Pyrenees for as long as we have written records, and probably far, far longer. The genetic evidence makes things even stranger. When researchers analyse Basque DNA, they find patterns that don't match their neighbours. Modern Spaniards and French show clear signs of multiple population migrations, layers of genetic influence from Celts, Romans, Visigoths, Arabs, all the groups that swept across Europe over the last few thousand years. But the Basques, they show remarkable genetic continuity. Their DNA suggests they've been in the same region for an extraordinarily long time, largely isolated from the waves of migration that transformed the rest of Europe. Population geneticists talk about founder effects, when a small isolated group maintains distinct genetic characteristics because they don't interbreed much with outsiders. The Basques show one of the strongest founder effects in Europe. It's like they set up shop in the Pyrenees thousands of years ago and then just stayed put while the rest of the continent was invaded, conquered, and genetically transformed over and over again. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of deep antiquity. The Basque region shows continuous human habitation stretching back into the Paleolithic. Cave paintings in places like Altamira, created over 30,000 years ago, show that humans were living in these mountains during the last ice age. We can't prove those ancient artists were ancestors of modern Basques, but the genetic and linguistic evidence suggests an unbroken line of occupation that might stretch back that far. Some researchers propose that the Basques are descendants of the original hunter-gatherers who populated Europe before the arrival of Indo-European speaking farmers around 5,000 years ago. When agriculture spread across the continent, it brought new languages, new genes, new ways of life that largely replaced or absorbed the earlier hunter-gatherer populations. But in the Pyrenees, maybe the old ways survived. Maybe the mountains provided enough isolation that the original inhabitants could resist or avoid the waves of change that transformed everywhere else. This would explain the language. If Euskara is a descendant of languages spoken in pre-Indo-European Europe, then of course it wouldn't match anything else. All its relatives went extinct thousands of years ago, replaced by the languages of incoming farmers and herders. The Basques would be linguistic time capsules, preserving a way of speaking that dates back to when Europe was populated by hunter-gatherers. And the Rh-negative blood. If the Basques really are descendants of these ancient pre-Indo-European populations, and if Rh-negative blood was more common among those populations, then what we're seeing in modern Basques is a genetic signal from deep time, a marker that's been preserved in an isolated population while being diluted everywhere else through thousands of years of mixing with incoming groups who carried the Rh-positive gene. But here's where things get really interesting. Some researchers have pushed this hypothesis even further. What if the Basques aren't just descendants of generic European hunter-gatherers? What if they're survivors of something more specific, more organised? Archaeological evidence from the late Ice Age shows sophisticated cultures in Western Europe. People who created elaborate cave art, who developed advanced hunting technologies, who built social networks capable of surviving in harsh glacial environments. What happened to them when the ice retreated and new populations moved in? The standard archaeological narrative says they were absorbed, that their genes and cultures were gradually swamped by incoming farmers. But what if some groups resisted? What if some populations were organised enough, isolated enough, or determined enough to maintain their independence? The mountains would be perfect refuges, hard to access, easy to defend, capable of supporting small populations who knew the terrain intimately. Could the Basques be the last remnant of a pre-agricultural European civilization that was otherwise erased by history? A culture sophisticated enough to maintain linguistic and genetic identity through thousands of years of pressure from outside groups. The idea sounds dramatic, but the genetic evidence is undeniable. The Basques are different. Measurably, significantly different from every population around them. Their blood carries secrets that mainstream genetics is still struggling to explain, and if Rh-negative blood really is marking them as survivors of something ancient, then understanding the Basques might be the key to understanding where that mysterious blood type came from in the first place. But they're not the only group that shows this pattern. Rh-negative blood appears with unusual frequency in another context entirely. Among the aristocratic bloodlines of Europe, the royal families who claim to rule by divine right. Here's something that doesn't get talked about much in polite historical circles. If you start mapping the blood types of European royal families, you notice a pattern, a really strange pattern. Rh-negative blood shows up way more often than it should. We're not talking about a slight statistical bump. We're talking about frequencies that make geneticists do double takes. In the general European population, Rh negative occurs in maybe 15 to 20% of people, depending on the region. Among documented royal bloodlines, especially the older houses, that number skyrockets. Some royal families show Rh negative frequencies approaching 50% or higher. That's not normal. That's not random genetic drift. That's something else entirely. Let's start with the most obvious question. Why were royal families so obsessed with bloodlines? And we're not talking about casual preference here. We're talking about obsession that lasted thousands of years, that shaped the entire political structure of Europe, that led to wars and assassinations and the restructuring of entire kingdoms. The official explanation is simple enough. Royals wanted to preserve their claim to power, keep wealth concentrated, maintain alliances between powerful families, all true, all documented. But here's what's interesting. The language they used wasn't about politics or economics. It was about blood, pure blood, royal blood, blood that was fundamentally different from commoner blood, blue blood. They talked about their lineages like they were protecting something precious, something that would be diluted or contaminated by mixing with ordinary people. Listen to how they described it in their own words. The divine right of kings didn't just mean God chose you to rule. It meant you carried something in your veins that made you fundamentally different from everyone else. Something inherited, something biological, something that couldn't be faked or acquired. You either had it or you didn't. Now the practice of royal intermarriage becomes really interesting when you look at it through this lens. For centuries, European royalty married almost exclusively within a tiny pool of families. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The family trees of European monarchy aren't trees at all. They're tangled webs where the same names appear over and over, looping back on themselves in ways that would make any modern geneticist extremely nervous. The Habsburg dynasty became infamous for this. The Spanish Habsburgs practiced such intensive interbreeding that by the end of their line, Charles II of Spain was more inbred than the offspring of direct siblings. His genome showed a coefficient of inbreeding of 25%. For context, the child of a brother and sister has a coefficient of 25%. Charles was the product of generations of this practice. He was severely disabled, couldn't chew his own food, probably couldn't father children, and the dynasty died with him in 1700. The official explanation is that royals didn't understand genetics, that they were just trying to keep power concentrated and accidentally destroyed themselves through ignorance. Maybe. But here's the thing. They kept doing it. Even when the effects were obvious, even when children were being born with severe disabilities, even when entire royal lines were dying out, they kept restricting their breeding pool to an impossibly small group of families. Why? What were they trying to preserve? The term blue blood itself is fascinating. The Spanish phrase sangre azul supposedly came from the pale skin of Spanish nobility, where you could see blue veins beneath the surface, unlike the darker-skinned Moors who had mixed with the common population. That's the standard explanation. But some researchers have pointed out something strange. Rh-negative blood actually does behave differently in terms of oxygenation and circulation. Some studies suggest Rh-negative individuals may have slightly different vascular characteristics. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make your veins literally look blue, but measurable differences nonetheless. Could there be a grain of truth buried in the metaphor? Were they describing something they could see but didn't have the scientific language to explain? Then there's the question of what certain royal houses actually knew about their bloodlines. The Egyptian pharaohs, who predate European monarchy by thousands of years, had elaborate genealogical records and practiced brother-sister marriage to keep bloodlines pure. The Ptolemaic dynasty, the last royal house of Egypt, maintained this practice right up until Cleopatra. They kept detailed records of lineages going back generations. They believed their blood carried divine essence, that mixing with commoners would dilute their connection to the gods. Similar practices show up in royal families across the ancient world. Incan nobility, Hawaiian alii, Japanese imperial family, all of them obsessed with pure bloodlines, all of them practicing intermarriage within impossibly small groups, all of them using language about divine blood that set them apart from ordinary humans. Either this is the same idea emerging independently in dozens of cultures by pure coincidence, or these royal families were all protecting something they considered genuinely precious, something genetic. Medieval European nobility took this even further. They didn't just practice intermarriage, they kept records, extensive, detailed genealogies going back centuries. The College of Arms in England, the various heraldic authorities across Europe, they weren't just tracking who owned what land. They were tracking bloodlines with scientific precision. Every marriage had to be approved, documented, verified. Every child's legitimacy was a matter of intense scrutiny. Why? Because inheritance was at stake, sure. But the language they used suggests something deeper. They talked about blood being polluted, contaminated, corrupted by mixing with common stock. They described noble blood as if it were a substance that could be diluted, that existed in concentrations, that had properties worth preserving at enormous cost. Some royal houses took it even further. The Order of the Golden Fleece, established in 1430, was limited to Catholic nobles of impeccable lineage. The Order of the Garter, the Order of the Thistle, various knightly orders across Europe, all of them had strict bloodline requirements. All of them maintained that only certain families carried the right blood. And here's what's really interesting. When genetic testing became available in the 20th century and researchers started analysing the blood types of these old noble families, they found those unusually high frequencies of Rh negative blood, the very thing that makes you medically incompatible with most of the population, that causes hemolytic disease of the newborn, that marks you as genetically distinct. The royal families had concentrated it through centuries of selective breeding. Accidentally or intentionally, they had preserved a blood type that mainstream science says came from a random mutation. They had guarded it, protected it, treated it as precious for hundreds of generations. Did they know? Did ancient rulers understand something about their blood that we're only now beginning to rediscover? Or were they protecting something without understanding what it was, following traditions passed down from ancestors who knew more than we give them credit for? The genetic evidence suggests that whatever the royal families were doing, they were doing it deliberately, systematically, for far longer than we can easily explain. In the ancient Near East, that intuition crystallized into one of the strangest, most haunting passages in the entire Bible, Genesis chapter 6. Just 4 verses, dropped like a fossilized fragment from a very different worldview. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. That's it. No detailed explanation, no footnotes, just a cryptic story about beings called sons of God, human women, and a hybrid offspring known as the Nephilim. Literally, the fallen ones. The text moves on almost immediately to the flood narrative, as if whatever happened here was so catastrophic that the only solution was to wipe the slate clean. For thousands of years, people have argued about what those sons of God actually were. One camp says they were just powerful human rulers, early kings taking whatever women they wanted. Another camp, much older and far more unsettling, says they were not human at all. In the oldest Jewish interpretations, sons of God meant divine or semi-divine beings, watchers, angels who were supposed to observe the world, not interfere with it. But they did interfere. They saw human women, desired them, and crossed a line they were never meant to cross. The result, according to this view, was a hybrid bloodline that should not have existed. a bloodline the rest of humanity could not easily absorb, biologically or spiritually. This is where the Nephilim theory of Rh negative blood starts to take shape. Modern proponents of this idea look at Genesis 6 and see more than myth. They see an ancient memory of genetic disruption, a time when a non-human or more than human lineage injected its code into the human gene pool, a lineage that, in this theory, might still be expressing itself today in a tiny percentage of people whose blood doesn't play by the normal rules. Rh negative. Remember what makes Rh negative so strange. Most humans carry the Rhd antigen. We're compatible, at least in theory, with the broader mammalian pattern. But Rh negative blood lacks that antigen entirely, and when Rh negative mothers carry Rh positive babies, the mother's immune system can treat the child's blood as a hostile intruder. It's as if, on a molecular level, something is saying, "This is not me, this is not my kind." The Nephilim hypothesis flips that script. Maybe it says Rh negative isn't the deviation. Maybe it's the remnant, the surviving trace of a bloodline that was never fully human to begin with, the other that refuses to merge cleanly with the rest of us. To see why anyone would think that, you have to leave Genesis and step into the Book of Enoch, a text that didn't make it into most modern Bibles, but was wildly influential in the ancient world. Enoch takes the compressed 4 verses of Genesis 6 and blows them up into an entire saga. In Enoch, the sons of God are explicitly called Watchers. 200 of them, led by figures with names like Semyaza and Azazel, descend to earth on Mount Hermon. They swear an oath together that they will all go through with the plan, take human wives, have children, and teach humanity forbidden knowledge. Metalworking, cosmetics, sorcery, astronomy, secrets of heaven that humans were supposedly not ready for. Their children, the Nephilim, are described as gigantic, ravenous beings who devour everything, animals, crops, even people. Their existence corrupts the earth so thoroughly that, in Enoch's telling, the flood isn't just about human wickedness. It's a targeted reset, a way to scrub this hybrid bloodline, and the knowledge that came with it, out of the world. But according to the text, it doesn't quite work. And there were giants on the earth in those days, and also after that. After the flood, echoes of the Nephilim keep showing up, in the Anakim and Rephaim of Canaan, in tales of mighty men, heroes and monsters, scattered through the ancient Near East, always towering, always other. If you zoom out, similar patterns emerge in other cultures. Sumerian stories of the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. Greek myths of gods descending to mate with mortals and producing demigods like Hercules. Indian accounts of devas and asuras influencing human bloodlines. Different names, different symbols, but the same core motif. Entities from elsewhere mixing with humans, creating a lineage that doesn't quite belong. The arch-negative Nephilim theory takes all of this and asks a forbidden question. What if these stories aren't just metaphors for kings and dynasties? What if they're distorted recollections of a real biological event? An ancient genetic intrusion that left fingerprints we can still detect in modern blood. Proponents point to a few things. The rarity of Rh-negative blood globally, but its concentration in certain isolated populations like the Basques. The unusual immune reactions in Rh-incompatible pregnancies, as if 2 different templates are clashing. The cluster of traits some studies loosely associate with Rh-negative individuals, slightly lower body temperature, different reaction to certain diseases, occasional resistance or sensitivity patterns that don't match the majority. To someone already primed by myths of fallen bloodlines, this looks suspiciously like a modern echo of an ancient hybridization. The idea runs like this. If a non-human or altered human group interbred with early Homo sapiens, you'd expect a small, persistent minority of the population to carry their markers. Not enough to dominate the gene pool, but enough to survive through protected or isolated lineages. Perhaps in mountain enclaves, perhaps in royal families who believed, rightly or wrongly, that their blue blood was different and needed to be preserved. In this framework, Rh negative blood becomes a biochemical whisper from Genesis 6, a vestige of the mighty men of old, men of renown, whose existence the rest of the human genome has been trying and failing to fully dilute. Of course, from a strict scientific standpoint, there is no confirmed link between Rh status and ancient angels, watchers, or sky gods. The RHD antigen is coded by a gene on chromosome 1. We can trace its variants, its deletions, its likely evolutionary paths. There is no line in any genetics paper that says, and here is where the Nephilim splice themselves in. But that's not really the point of the theory. Its power doesn't come from lab results. It comes from an intersection of puzzles, a blood factor whose origins are still debated. Mythologies obsessed with forbidden unions and hybrid offspring, a biblical passage so strange that later editors seem almost embarrassed by it, trimming it down to 4 enigmatic verses and hoping no one would ask too many questions. People are asking now. The Nephilim hypothesis doesn't claim to be proven fact. It sits in that grey zone between genetics and mythology, where hard data thins out and symbolic patterns start to glow. It offers a story that tries to stitch together a missing link in Rh-negative origins by reaching back, not just into prehistory, but into a time when humans explained anomalies in terms of gods, angels, and fallen ones. Maybe Rh-negative blood is exactly what mainstream science says it is, a naturally occurring variant that emerged through mutation and selection. Maybe that's all. Or maybe, buried in those ancient accounts of forbidden unions and corrupted bloodlines, there is a distorted memory of something our ancestors couldn't fully understand, but refused to forget. Because whether or not the Nephilim were real, the question they raise is, why does a small fraction of humanity carry a blood code that clashes so violently with the rest? And why do the oldest stories we have insist that once, long ago, something entered our blood that was never meant to be there? The Nephilim theory doesn't answer those questions. It sharpens them. It turns Rh, negative blood from a medical curiosity, into a possible relic of a much older drama, one that might not be limited to earthbound explanations at all. Imagine this. You've traced Rh-negative blood through deserts, mountains, and royal courts. You've watched it show up in tiny enclaves of Europe, in scattered pockets across the globe, in lineages that behave more like secret threads than random distributions. At some point, a disturbing question starts to creep in at the edges of your mind. What if this isn't just a natural variation? What if someone put it here? That's the core of the ancient astronaut hypothesis when it comes to Rh-negative blood. The claim isn't subtle. It says that somewhere deep in prehistory, when our ancestors were still struggling with stone tools and survival, a non-human intelligence intervened, not by landing on the White House lawn or carving their names into mountains, but by doing something far more permanent. They altered our genetics. They left a mark in our blood. And for some researchers and enthusiasts, that mark is Rh-negative. To understand why this idea refuses to die, you have to go back to one of the oldest written civilizations on Earth, Sumer, southern Mesopotamia, over 5,000 years ago. Long before Greek philosophers, long before the Bible, the Sumerians were scratching wedge-shaped symbols into clay tablets, recording transactions, myths, star charts, and something much stranger. Stories of beings called the Anunnaki. According to those texts, the Anunnaki were not gods in the abstract way we think of today. They were described as real, physical entities. They descended from the heavens. They had names, rivalries, jobs. Some ruled cities, some oversaw specific tasks, and in certain myths they did something even more unsettling. They created humans. One Sumerian text speaks of the fashioning of man from clay mixed with the blood of a god. In another, divine beings complain about hard labour, about digging canals and tending fields until a decision is made. Make a worker race, a species that can do the heavy lifting, not as equals but as servants. Read those stories metaphorically and they're just myths, early attempts to explain where we came from. Read them literally, and they sound disturbingly like a genetic engineering project. This is where Zecharia Sitchin enters the picture. In the 1970s, Sitchin published a series of books arguing that the Sumerian Anunnaki were not just mythological deities, but flesh and blood extraterrestrials from a distant planet he called Nibiru. He claimed they arrived on Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago, mined its resources, and at some point decided to create a hybrid species using their own genetic material and that of a primitive hominin already living here. In Sitchin's telling, humans are not just products of slow, blind evolution. We're an engineered workforce, a created species, a bio-project. Now, Sitchin never focused heavily on Rh-negative blood himself, but his framework became the perfect container for a new twist. If the Anunnaki gave us their genes, maybe those genes still show up as anomalies in our biology. Maybe the Rh-negative factor is one of those anomalies, a relic of an off-world contribution to our DNA. Think about what Rh-negative actually does. Most human pregnancies are biologically cooperative. The mother's body supports the fetus, treats it as part of herself, guides it safely into the world. But in an Rh-incompatible pregnancy, something else happens. The mother's immune system can see the fetus as foreign, as intruder, as other. To believers in the ancient astronaut hypothesis, this isn't just a medical complication. It's a sign of mixed heritage. They argue that if Rh-negative entered the human gene pool from an external source, an added lineage, then the immune conflict between Rh-negative mothers and Rh-positive fetuses is exactly what you'd expect from two distinct lineages being forced to coexist in one species. A quiet war happening in the womb. That's the theory. But it doesn't stop there. Over the last few decades, patterns have been collected, catalogued, whispered about in late-night forums and anonymous surveys. Self-described Rh-negative individuals report unusual traits, heightened sensitivity, intense dreams, feelings of not quite belonging. Many of those same communities began to notice something else. A disproportionate number of people who claim alien abduction or contact experiences also claim to be Rh-negative. Stories emerge that sound disturbingly similar. Lights in the bedroom, lost time, medical procedures, a sense of being studied, monitored, tracked. Some describe repeated blood tests, genetic sampling, reproductive interference. Others say that successive generations of their family, grandmothers, mothers, children, have all had similar experiences. The common thread, they insist, is the blood. From this, another layer of speculation unfolds. If extraterrestrials altered human DNA once, perhaps they never stopped. Maybe modern abduction experiences aren't random. Maybe they're targeted follow-ups, ongoing monitoring of a specific bloodline, the Rh-negative bloodline. Are these stories evidence? Not in the scientific sense. They're anecdotes, often unverified, sometimes contradictory. But they exist in such numbers and with such similar themes that they've become part of the mythology surrounding Rh-negative blood. A living, evolving folklore of contact, experiment, and surveillance, written not in stone tablets, but in personal testimony and late-night confessions. Meanwhile, Sitchin's interpretations have seeped into popular culture. His Anunnaki show up in documentaries, novels, video games, conspiracy boards. The idea that gods were actually spacefaring genetic engineers has become almost mainstream in speculative circles. You can watch it migrate from fringe paperbacks to glossy streaming series, from obscure lectures to casual conversations. But what does mainstream science say? Here, the story comes crashing back to Earth. Geneticists, anthropologists, and evolutionary biologists overwhelmingly reject the ancient astronaut hypothesis. They point out that H-factor differences can be explained by known evolutionary mechanisms: random mutation, genetic drift, founder effects, selection pressures we don't fully understand yet. They remind us that incompatibility between mother and fetus shows up in other species too. It's not unique to humans, and certainly not unique to Rh negative. They'll tell you that the Sumerian texts are religious and political documents written in a symbolic language that doesn't map neatly onto modern science fiction. They'll note that Sitchin's translations and interpretations have been criticized heavily by professional Assyriologists, who argue that he distorted or misread key terms to fit his narrative. To them, the Anunnaki are deities, not astronauts. The blood of a god is mythic language, not a lab protocol. As for the alien abduction connection, psychologists point to sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucinations, cultural priming, and the power of suggestion. They argue that once a narrative becomes popular, small grey beings, bright lights, missing time, people unconsciously mould their experiences to match it, especially under hypnosis or in high-stress states. And they'll say that any correlation between Rh negative blood and abduction claims could simply be statistical noise amplified by confirmation bias. So where does that leave you? On one side, you have ancient texts describing non-human beings shaping mankind. You have a strange blood factor that behaves differently from the norm, that can make mother and child biologically incompatible. You have clusters of folklore and modern testimony tying Rh negative individuals to stories of contact and interference. On the other side, you have a scientific framework that, so far, finds no need to invoke extraterrestrials. Mutations happen, blood types vary, myths exaggerate, minds misfire. The ancient astronaut hypothesis lives precisely in that gap, in the space between what we can prove and what we can't quite explain. It takes the anomalies, the Sumerian gods who behave like engineers, the blood that refuses to fully cooperate, the people who insist something is visiting them, and threads them into a single narrative. You are not entirely of this earth. Is that narrative true? We don't know. The genetic record as we understand it now doesn't require aliens, but absence of necessity is not the same as proof of absence. What we can say with confidence is that the idea itself has power. It has reshaped how millions of people think about our origins, about our bodies, about the possibility that our species carries a foreign signature hidden in its veins. And if Rh negative blood is not proof of extraterrestrial intervention, it is at least a perfect symbol of it. A quiet, stubborn anomaly. A code that doesn't quite fit. A reminder that even in something as seemingly ordinary as a blood test, there may be mysteries deep enough to make us question what it really means to be human. Because whether written on clay tablets, etched into myth, or pulsing through your arteries, the same unsettling question keeps returning. Whose blood exactly are we carrying? And if there was a second hand on the wheel of our evolution, what else might it have left behind? Now take everything we've talked about so far, genetic bottlenecks, scattered survivor groups, strange pockets of ancestry that refuse to blend in, and stretch that story forward in time. Imagine that somewhere between those Ice Age migrations and the rise of the first known civilizations, one culture pulls ahead of the rest. Not just a little bit, a lot. This is where Atlantis walks onto the stage. The idea sounds like pure myth. A glittering island empire, impossibly advanced, swallowed by the sea in a single terrible day and night. But buried inside that story is a question that refuses to die. What if Atlantis, whatever it really was, left more behind than ruined cities on the ocean floor? What if it left people? Bloodlines, a genetic fingerprint that still shows up in a small, stubborn fraction of the population. This is the hypothesis some researchers whisper about when they talk about Rh, negative blood. First, the pattern. When you map Rh negative frequencies across the world, something strange happens. You don't get an even spread, you get clusters, hotspots. The highest concentration is in the Basque country, tucked between Spain and France on the Atlantic coast, but it doesn't stop there. Elevated levels ripple outward along the old seafaring margins of Western Europe, coastal Brittany, parts of Ireland and the British Isles, the Atlantic-facing edges of Portugal and northern Spain. Then scattered echoes along other Atlantic routes, pockets in North Africa, traces in former Phoenician and later maritime trading hubs. It looks less like a random distribution and more like the wake of something that moved along the Atlantic rim. Now put that map next to another one, the one in Plato's description. Plato gives us the earliest written account of Atlantis in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias. He claims he's passing on a story preserved by Egyptian priests, a mighty maritime power beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar, commanding islands and coastal territories on both sides of the Atlantic approaches. A culture with advanced engineering, monumental architecture, and a navy that could cross oceans. Then, after a period of moral decline, a cataclysm. Earthquakes, floods, the entire power base vanishing beneath the sea. Most academics will tell you Plato was constructing a moral allegory, a thought experiment about ideal states and their corruption. But then there's that maddening detail. The geography he describes sits precisely where later oceanographers would identify some of the most unstable tectonic and volcanic zones in the Atlantic, places where entire land masses could, under the right conditions, be uplifted or drowned. And then there's the timing. Plato dates Atlantis to about 9,000 years before Solon, the Athenian lawgiver who supposedly heard the story in Egypt. That drops us roughly around 11,600 years ago, right at the tail end of the last ice age, right when sea levels were rising fast, right when coastlines everywhere were being redrawn, swallowing river valleys, low islands, and coastal plains that had been habitable for thousands of years. You can call that a coincidence, but if you're willing to suspend disbelief for a moment, you can also read it as a glitch in the record. A distorted memory of the time when the ocean literally moved in and erased entire worlds from the map. Now bring Rh negative blood back into the picture. The Atlantis bloodline hypothesis goes like this. Before the final meltwater pulses and sea level rise, there existed a networked coastal civilization, not necessarily one glittering city with crystal towers, but a chain of advanced settlements strung along the Atlantic margins, on now drowned shelves off Iberia, North Africa, maybe even the mid-Atlantic islands. They were seafarers, traders, technologists of their time, whatever that technology looked like 12,000 years ago. And they carried a distinctive genetic marker, a higher frequency of Rh negative blood. Then the flood came. Not a single Hollywood wave, but centuries of rising seas punctuated by violent storms, earthquakes and local tsunamis. Ports vanished, low plains disappeared, whole populations were forced inland. Those coastal elites, those sailors, those engineers, scattered. Some fled north along the European Atlantic coast, some crossed into the Mediterranean, some drifted south along the African shore. In each new refuge, they interbred with local hunter-gatherers and early farmers, leaving diluted traces of their original gene pool. If that happened, you'd expect to see exactly what we see now. an oddly high concentration of a rare blood type in a few isolated coastal pockets, especially in regions like the Basque country, where language and culture also look strangely ancient and resistant to outside influence. This is where Cro-Magnon enters the story. Cro-Magnon is the name once given to the earliest clearly modern humans in Europe, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, arriving from Africa and the Near East, and spreading into Ice Age Europe tens of thousands of years before our supposed Atlantis window. Fossils associated with these populations show up in France, Spain, and across Western Europe. And here's the twist. Some of those skulls and skeletal remains from Atlantic Europe have cranial and facial features that, to some researchers, look eerily similar to later populations in the Basque region. The Cro-Magnon migration theory, when blended with the Atlantis hypothesis, suggests a layered story. First wave, early modern humans pouring into Europe during the Upper Paleolithic, adapted to cold, harsh environments, hunting megafauna along the Atlantic fringe. Second wave, much later, near the end of the Ice Age, a more organised, possibly semi-maritime culture, emerging on those same coasts as glaciers retreat and resources explode. This second wave, our hypothetical Atlanteans, builds on the genetic and cultural foundation of those early Cro-Magnon Europeans. If a subpopulation among them carries Rh negative at higher frequencies, and if that subpopulation is heavily concentrated in seafaring coastal communities, then when catastrophe hits, their descendants would be the ones forced to migrate along the very routes where we now see Rh negative clustering. The Basque anomaly starts to look less like an isolated oddity and more like a surviving island in a genetic storm. Basques stand out not just for their Rh negative frequencies, but for their language isolate Euskara, which appears to have no clear relatives among Indo-European tongues. Their folklore hints at ancient mountain refuges, older gods, and a deep connection to the land and the sea. If there really were Atlantean survivors, people pushed inland and upward by rising seas, Basque territory, the rugged Pyrenees and nearby coasts, would be exactly the kind of place you'd expect them to dig in and endure, and they're not alone. Other Atlantic-facing populations, certain Celtic groups in Ireland and Britain, fragments in Brittany and Portugal, show elevated H negative levels, faint echoes of the same pattern. Some legends from these regions also speak of lands lost to the sea, sunken kingdoms, drowned cities whose bells can still be heard beneath the waves on stormy nights. Folklore is not evidence, but sometimes it's a map pointing to traumas so old that only stories remember them. Of course, mainstream genetics doesn't endorse an Atlantean bloodline. Rh negative can be explained as a mutation that rose in frequency through drift, selection, or both. The distribution could be shaped by farming expansions, isolation, random founder effects. All of that is plausible. All of it is backed by data. Yet the pattern along the Atlantic still feels suggestive, a rare trait clustered along old maritime routes. A series of legends about a lost coastal civilization destroyed by rising seas. A philosophical text by Plato that just happens to peg its destruction to the exact end of the last ice age. A mountain people with an ancient language sitting at the center of the highest Rh negative hotspot on Earth. Maybe these are disconnected facts, stitched together by human pattern seeking. Maybe Atlantis is just a story, and Rh negative is just a quirk of hemoglobin genetics. Or maybe, buried somewhere in the tangled roots of our ancestry, there really was a civilization that pushed ahead too early, built its world too close to the shifting edge of the sea, and paid the price when the ice melted. If that's true, Rh negative blood wouldn't just be a medical curiosity. It would be a living relic, a faint, persistent echo of a lost world, a code that survived the flood. If Rh negative blood were just a minor medical quirk, The story would probably end with pregnancy complications and transfusion charts, but it doesn't. Because when you start listening to people who carry this blood, you hear something else. Patterns, repeated claims, odd little consistencies that show up in forums, interviews, surveys, and late-night conversations that were never supposed to become data. Ask Rh negative people to describe themselves, and they very often reach for the same words. Different. Out of place. Like I'm watching the world from the outside. That's not a lab result. That's a feeling. But it's a feeling that keeps showing up. There are whole lists circulating online. Common traits of Rh negatives. Some are easy to dismiss as vague or universal, but others are oddly specific. Heightened intuition, strong gut feelings, a sense of knowing things before they happen. Unusual sensitivity to environments, to people's moods, to places that feel off for reasons they can't explain. You see stories like this again and again. Someone walks into a room and instantly knows two people just had a fight, even if they're smiling. Someone avoids a road for no rational reason, and later hears there was a deadly accident there at the time they should have been passing through. For most people, this goes in the coincidence file. For some Rh negatives, it's just another Tuesday. Dig deeper and the reports get stranger. Psychic sensitivity. Vivid, almost hyper-real dreams. Episodes of déjà vu that feel less like, I've been here before, and more like, I remember this decision from another timeline. Some claim to see auras, or sense electromagnetic fields, or feel physically sick in places where tragic events occurred long ago. None of this has been nailed to a gene or a receptor. Science doesn't have a neat molecular diagram for, I felt something bad was going to happen, and then it did. But the volume of these stories among Rh negatives is hard to ignore, especially when they repeat across cultures and languages, from people who have never heard of each other's experiences. Then there are the physical oddities. Rh negatives often report a slightly lower than average body temperature, not hospital emergency low, just off. 97.2 instead of 98.6, 96.8 on a regular day with no illness. Doctors usually shrug and say, normal varies, which is true. But when enough people with the same rare blood factor say, my baseline is colder, it sparks questions. Alongside that, many describe poor circulation, cold hands and feet even in warm weather, a tendency toward feeling chilled when others are comfortable. Some connect this to that eerie sense of being out of phase with their surroundings, physically as well as socially. Their bodies aren't quite running on the same thermal settings as everyone else's. Sunlight sensitivity is another recurring theme. Rh negative individuals talking about burning easily, feeling drained by intense sunlight, or needing sunglasses more often than people around them. Light that others call pleasant feels harsh, overstimulating, almost aggressive. In extreme cases, they describe headaches, dizziness, or fatigue after only brief exposure. Skeptics point out that fair skin, eye colour and latitude explain a lot of this. And that's true. But even controlling for those factors, the anecdotes stack up. I'm not the palest one in my family, but I'm the only one who gets wiped out by the sun. Again, not proof, but a pattern. Then there's the controversial claim, higher intelligence. You can find Rh negative communities confidently asserting that they have higher IQs on average. They point to famous historical figures rumoured to have Rh negative blood. They collect stories of strong analytical abilities, intense curiosity, and an almost compulsive drive to figure things out. The scientific evidence here is thin and fragile. Large-scale, well-controlled studies linking Rh factor directly to IQ simply don't exist yet in any definitive way. A few small studies have tried to connect blood groups, including ABO and Rh, to cognitive traits, but their results are inconsistent, often statistically weak, and rarely replicated. And yet the belief persists, fueled by self-perception and the types of people who end up asking about their blood type in the first place. People who already question the world. People who already feel mentally out of step. Is Rh negative blood actually linked to higher cognitive capacity? Or is it that introspective, analytical people are more likely to notice and obsess over being Rh negative? To untangle this, we can look at the broader landscape of research on blood types and personality. In Japan and parts of East Asia, there's a long-standing cultural fascination with the idea that ABO blood types correlate with temperament. Type A as meticulous and anxious, Type O as confident and outgoing, and so on. Psychologists have tested these claims repeatedly. Most large studies find little to no robust correlation once you account for biases. People tend to interpret their traits to match what they've been told about their blood type, a powerful form of confirmation bias. When researchers have looked at personality using established models like the Big Five, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, the links to blood type are usually weak or non-existent. The Urch factor has been even less studied in this context, partly because it's medically important but socially invisible. No pop culture, no stereotypes, no decades of expectation to warp how people see themselves. That makes Rh negative claims more interesting. There isn't a century of cultural conditioning telling Rh negatives they should be psychic, intuitive, or alien feeling. Those narratives are relatively new, emerging from grassroots online communities, not ancient myths. The traits may still be shaped by suggestion, but the suggestion itself is young and rapidly evolving. So where does the line fall between what's documented and what's anecdotal? Documented. Rh negative blood is a minority trait, more common in some populations than others. Documented. It creates genuine medical complications in pregnancy and transfusions. Documented. Some minor physiological differences, like slightly different risks for certain diseases, have been reported in the literature, though results can conflict. Anecdotal. The cluster of psychic experiences, empathic sensitivity, and outsider psychology that many Rh negatives describe. Anecdotal. Claims of consistently lower body temperature and unusual sun sensitivity. Anecdotal. The insistence on higher IQ or advanced cognitive abilities. The honest answer is that right now, these belong to the grey zone, not proven, not disproven, not rigorously mapped. The data is scattered, personal, emotional. It lives in comment sections and journal entries, not in double-blind trials and peer-reviewed charts. But if these patterns are real, even partly real, why might they exist? One possibility is purely genetic and mundane. The Rh factor isn't just a label, it's a protein involved in how red blood cells handle certain molecules, including possibly ammonia and CO2. Subtle differences in blood chemistry could, in theory, ripple into differences in brain metabolism, thermoregulation, or sensory processing. Not enough to create a different species, but enough to nudge perception and physiology in a slightly different direction. Another possibility is selective history. If Rh negative frequencies rose in certain isolated populations, perhaps they carried along clusters of other genes, linked by proximity on the chromosome, that affected the nervous system, immune function, or hormone regulation. A blood factor hitchhiking with a specific cognitive style. Then there's the more speculative territory, where many Rh negatives themselves like to dwell. The idea that their blood marks a surviving fragment of an ancient lineage, Neanderthal admixture, Denisovan echoes, or something even older, even stranger. In that view, unusual intuition or sensitivity might not be a defect or a coincidence, but a remnant. a leftover toolkit for reading environments, sensing danger, or navigating a world we no longer recognize. From a psychological angle, there's also the effect of being rare. Knowing you have a blood type that can literally make your body reject a pregnancy changes how you see yourself. Being told you're part of the 10 to 15%, not the majority, can create a quiet sense of separation. And when people feel different, they often notice and magnify every experience that confirms that difference. Maybe the Rh negative phenomenon is a mix of all of this. A real biological variant layered with real social and psychological consequences, wrapped in stories, amplified by the internet and infused with humanity's old habit of turning anything rare into something sacred or suspicious. What we can say with certainty is simple. Rh negative blood is more than a line on a lab report. It has become an identity, a mystery, and for many a doorway into questions about who we are, where we came from, and what might be coded into us that we still don't understand. Mainstream science starts in a very different place from ancient gods, lost continents, or alien engineers. It starts with something far less dramatic but no less powerful, a tiny copying error. According to genetics, Rh negative began as exactly that, a mutation. Somewhere tens of thousands of years ago, a child was born whose DNA carried a small change in the gene responsible for producing the RhD protein on red blood cells. Instead of R positive, that child cells lacked the usual marker. They were Rh negative. From a scientific perspective, this isn't unusual at all. Our genomes are mutation factories. Every generation, each of us is born with dozens of new genetic changes that our parents didn't have. Most of them do nothing. Some are harmful and vanish because the people who carry them don't leave many descendants. A few are helpful and spread like wildfire. So the conventional story goes like this. Rh negative appears as a random mutation in a small group of people. It doesn't immediately kill them, it doesn't prevent them from having children, and under certain conditions it might even help them. Over many generations, in some regions, the mutation spreads. In others, it stays rare or disappears. On paper, that looks simple. But the moment you remember what Rh negative actually does in pregnancy, the story gets complicated. Because Rh negative mothers can't safely carry Rh positive babies without medical help, you'd expect natural selection to wipe this mutation out. Rh negative women in a mixed population should have had more pregnancy complications, more stillbirths, fewer surviving children. In evolutionary terms, that should be a death sentence for the gene, and yet it didn't die, it survived. In some places, it thrived. So mainstream researchers ask a very different question than conspiracy theorists do. Not, what strange intelligence put this here, but what was Rh negative doing for our ancestors that was so valuable it survived despite its brutal reproductive cost? This is where natural selection turns the story on its head. Biologists talk about fitness trade-offs. A trait can be bad in one context but good enough in another that it still wins overall. Sickle cell disease is the classic example. One copy of the sickle cell gene makes you more resistant to malaria. 2 copies can kill you, yet in areas with heavy malaria, the gene spread because the survival advantage against the parasite outweighed the risk of disease. Some scientists think Rh negative might be playing a similar game. One line of research looks at disease resistance. The Rh system isn't just a label hospitals stick on your blood bag. These proteins are embedded in the membrane of your red blood cells. They change the way your cells interact with your immune system, with pathogens, with your body's chemistry. Several studies have hinted that Rh negative status might protect against certain infections, or at least change how your body responds to them. The evidence is still scattered, sometimes contradictory, often based on small samples. But patterns keep popping up that are too interesting to ignore. Some researchers have proposed that Rh-negative individuals might be less susceptible to specific parasites, or that their immune systems react differently to chronic infections. Others have suggested that the altered structure of Rh-negative red blood cells might affect how some microbes attach, invade, or survive in the bloodstream. The most intriguing work touches on malaria. For decades, scientists have been cataloguing how different blood traits influence malaria risk, sickle cell, thalassemia, Duffy negativity. These aren't random, they're genetic scars left by our long war with the parasite. Wherever malaria has raged, the human genome looks like a battlefield. Rh-negative is rarer globally than these other traits, and its distribution doesn't line up neatly with malaria zones. But there are hints that in some ancient environments, in specific microregions, Rh-negative might have provided an edge, maybe against older malaria strains, maybe against other blood-borne parasites that have since vanished, maybe even against diseases we no longer recognize. If Rh-negative gave just a modest survival advantage in one of those ancient hot zones, a higher chance of living to adulthood, a slightly better resistance to a lethal childhood disease, then evolution suddenly stops seeing it as the pregnancy problem and starts seeing it as the survival upgrade that sometimes comes at a cost. Multiply that over thousands of years, and a paradoxical pattern emerges. A trait that makes childbirth more dangerous could still spread if, on balance, carriers survive more threats between birth and reproduction. But disease resistance isn't the only explanation mainstream science offers. Another major theory is population isolation. Imagine a small group living in a rugged, hard-to-reach region. Mountains, valleys, caves, islands. In that group, by chance, a higher percentage of people carry the Rh-negative mutation. They marry within the group. They have children within the group. Over time, the mutation stops being rare. It becomes common, maybe even dominant. This is what geneticists call a founder effect. A few individuals with rare variations start a population. Because of isolation, their genes shape the entire group's genetic profile. This kind of process could help explain places like the Basque country, where Rh-negative levels are unusually high. According to mainstream theories, you don't need visitors from the stars or survivors of Atlantis. You just need a few founders carrying the mutation, a little isolation, and a lot of time. Within this framework, the Rh-negative map starts to look less like a cosmic clue and more like a record of ancient human movement and separation. Pockets of high Rh-negative frequency become hints of old bottlenecks, old refuges, old communities that stayed apart just long enough for their genetic quirks to become defining features. So what does science actually explain well? It explains how Rh-negative could appear, random mutation. It explains one powerful way it could spread, a trade-off where survival advantages in certain environments outweighed the reproductive hazards. It explains why we see regional clusters, founder effects and population isolation during times when groups were small, scattered, and often cut off from one another. It even explains some of the strangest parts of the story. The fact that Rh-negative is common in some Indo-European populations but rare in others, that it can sit at low levels in many regions for millennia without vanishing, that modern medicine has dramatically changed its evolutionary fate by protecting Rh-incompatible pregnancies that nature once punished. But there are still shadows on the map. We don't yet know exactly what, if any, concrete disease resistance Rh-negative provides. Studies are ongoing, results are mixed, and many of the most tantalizing ideas remain hypotheses, not hard proof. We don't know precisely when or how many times the Rh-negative mutation appeared. We don't fully understand why its distribution looks the way it does today, with some regions showing spikes that simple drift and isolation don't fully satisfy. Mainstream research doesn't claim to have all the answers. It offers frameworks, probabilities, models that make Rh negative less of an impossibility and more of an extreme outlier in a system already full of strange genetic trade-offs. In other words, science can tell us how Rh negative might have emerged, how it might have survived, and why it might cluster where it does. But whether that story is complete, or whether Rh negative is still whispering about forgotten epidemics, lost populations, or evolutionary gambles we haven't yet decoded, that part remains open. And where science leaves questions, mystery quietly slips back in. From the moment you were conceived, something started writing inside you. Not with ink, not with language, but with molecules, chemical marks laid down on your DNA like invisible annotations in the margins of a book. Some came from your parents, some from your grandparents, some perhaps from people who lived and died so long ago their names were never spoken aloud. This is the territory of epigenetics, and it raises a question that should not be possible. How much of your past is in your blood, and how much of your ancestors' lives still moves in you? For most of the 20th century, genetics seemed simple enough. Genes were blueprints. You inherited eye color, height, maybe a predisposition to certain diseases. Your DNA was your hardware. Your life experiences were your software. Two separate layers, never mixing. Then researchers started finding things that didn't fit that clean separation. Starving pregnant women during the Dutch hunger winter of 1944 gave birth to children who grew up with altered metabolisms, higher risks of obesity and heart disease. Those children passed similar risks to their own children, even if they themselves never went hungry. Something about the experience of famine had been recorded and transmitted, not as a new gene, as a new pattern of switches on existing genes. This is epigenetics. Not changing the letters of DNA, but changing which parts are read, when, and how strongly. Tiny chemical tags, methyl groups, acetyl groups, attached to DNA and to the proteins that package it. They can silence genes or amplify them. They can lock stress responses on high alert or damp them down for a calmer life. And some of these tags don't reset with every generation. Some slip through the reset process and show up in children and grandchildren. It's not memory in the way you remember your first day of school, but it is memory in the sense that your body has a record of what your lineage has been through. Famine, trauma, toxins, abundance, safety, all leaving faint chemical fingerprints. Once you accept that, another thought follows. If the body can carry imprints of experience, how far does that go? Across cultures, across millennia, humans have treated blood as if it carried more than red cells and oxygen. Blood was lineage, honor, sin, oath, blessing. When ancient priests sprinkled blood on altars, when warriors swore blood oaths, when kings insisted on pure bloodlines, they weren't talking about alleles and antigens. They were acting as if blood itself held some deep identity code, a kind of living archive. In Mesopotamia, blood was used in rituals to bind the living to gods and ancestors. In Mesoamerica, rulers offered their own blood to renew the cosmos, as if the universe fed on whatever was encoded in their veins. In medieval Europe, stories of bad blood and noble blood weren't just insults or compliments. They implied that character and destiny were carried in the circulatory system, whether anyone understood the biology or not. Modern science shrugs at that. Blood is tissue. It carries cells, nutrients, hormones. Personality and memory are in the brain, not in the veins. Except the evidence isn't quite that clean. Heart transplant recipients sometimes report startling changes after surgery. New cravings, new fears, odd flashes of images that feel like memories but aren't theirs. A lifelong vegetarian suddenly wants fried chicken. Someone who hated classical music develops an obsession with it, only to discover the donor was a devoted violinist. Most of these stories are anecdotal, impossible to test under lab conditions, easy to dismiss as coincidence, suggestion, trauma response. And yet, there are enough of them that researchers have given the idea a name: cellular memory. The hypothesis that cells outside the brain might store traces of experience, patterns of activity, chemical signatures that can influence another person when transplanted. Nothing conclusive, nothing you could put in a textbook, but enough to keep the question alive. If cells can carry such imprints, blood becomes more than a delivery system. It becomes a moving archive of your body's state. Hormones that encode stress or calm. Immune cells trained by decades of exposure to specific pathogens. Epigenetic marks quietly riding along on white blood cells, recording what your lineage has been fighting, fearing, surviving. Now imagine this in the context of Rh-negative blood. We know Rh-negative status is defined by the absence of a particular protein on the surface of red blood cells. At the molecular level, it's a missing structure, a small deletion, a gap. But what if that gap is more than just an absence? What if it changes not just how the immune system reacts to pregnancy, but which genes are turned up or down across the entire system? Some Rh-negative individuals report odd clusters of traits: heightened sensitivity, vivid dreams, a sense of not quite fitting into normal social patterns. Correlation is not causation. Many people without Rh-negative blood say the same things, but the pattern invites speculation. Could that missing protein be linked to a different baseline setting in the nervous system, a slightly altered stress response, a different way of processing social information? Epigenetic studies are in their infancy here. No one has yet produced a definitive Rh-negative epigenome map. But conceptually, nothing prevents it. If the immune environment in an Rh-negative mother is dramatically different during pregnancy, enough to view an Rh-positive fetus as an invader, then the chemical signals bathing that developing child are also different. Those signals could nudge epigenetic switches in subtle ways. Those switches could be passed on. Over many generations, you wouldn't just have a blood group. You'd have a lineage with its own pattern of inherited settings, some obvious, some buried deep. Ancient traditions may have intuited this without the language to describe it. When priestly castes, royal families, or secret societies were obsessed with keeping certain bloodlines pure, they may have been guarding not just genes, but consistent epigenetic patterns, stable configurations of stress responses, cognition, temperament, maintained by tight control over who married whom, who bred with whom, who was allowed inside the circle and who was kept out. Modern genetic research, meanwhile, keeps finding echoes of ancestral experience in our molecular machinery. Children of Holocaust survivors show altered stress hormone profiles. Grandchildren of people exposed to severe environmental toxins exhibit changes in disease risk. Epigenetic tags endure longer than anyone expected. They don't just vanish with each new life, they whisper forward. Put that beside the old idea of ancestor spirits guiding the living, beside shamanic traditions where healers claim to access the memories of their forebears through trance, through bloodletting, through ritual ingestion of sacramental substances. Strip away the metaphors, and you're left with a provocative possibility. What they called spirits and ancestral voices might be the subjective side of something physical. Ancestral patterns encoded into the body, influencing emotion, perception, intuition. In that light, Rh-negative blood stops being just a medical curiosity and becomes a potential signal flare from the deep past. A marker that a particular lineage diverged, endured its own selection pressures, accumulated its own set of biochemical notes in the margins of its DNA. Not a different species, not a mystical upgrade, but a branch of the human family whose hidden code might preserve a slightly different record of what came before. We don't know. The science is incomplete, the stories are messy, the data is noisy. But between the new research on epigenetics and cellular memory, and the old obsessions with bloodlines, sacrifice and ritual, a strange convergence is forming. Ancient wisdom traditions spoke of blood as carrying destiny, curse, blessing, even knowledge. Modern genetics speaks of DNA and epigenetic tags carrying risk, resilience, adaptation. Different languages, same underlying intuition. What flows in your veins is more than fuel. It is history, translated into chemistry. If Rh-negative blood is part of that story, and all the anomalies suggest it might be, then the question becomes unavoidable. What exactly have your ancestors written into you, and what part of that script has yet to be read? Modern medicine was supposed to solve the blood mystery, classify every type, catalogue every antigen, build neat charts and inventory systems, wrap the whole thing in rational order. And in a lot of ways it worked. We can now perform transplants that would have been unthinkable a century ago. We can predict most transfusion reactions before they happen. We can screen, match and monitor with a precision your great-grandparents would have called sorcery. But sitting right in the middle of all that progress is something strangely familiar, a remnant of the old Enigma, Rh-negative. In the 21st century, Rh-negative blood isn't just a curiosity, it's a logistical problem, a medical priority, and according to some, a classified asset. Start with something mundane, blood banks. On the surface they're simple, people donate, hospitals store, doctors use, but behind the scenes it's a constant balancing act. Blood expires, demand fluctuates, accidents don't schedule themselves, so you'd think the main concern would just be more blood, any blood. It's not. If you listen carefully to blood bank appeals, you'll notice a pattern. They don't just ask for donors, they beg for specific donors. We urgently need O-negative. Rh-negative donors are critically low. If you're Rh-negative, your donation is especially important. Why? Because in the modern system, Rh-negative is both the weakest link and the strongest card in the deck. Medically, Rh-negative blood is rare, in some populations extremely rare, and that scarcity causes nightmares for hospital planners. A car crash victim with AB-negative blood, a child with a rare condition who can only receive Rh-negative, a pregnant Rh-negative mother who needs carefully matched blood after a complicated delivery. If the supply isn't there when they need it, there's no substitute, no workaround, no clever trick. But there's another side. Certain Rh-negative types, especially O-negative, are universal donors for red cells. In trauma bays around the world, when there's no time to type and cross-match, when someone is bleeding out on the table and seconds matter more than anything, the go-to option is clear. Grab the O-negative. The rarest becomes the most useful. The minority blood type becomes the emergency standard. So blood banks track Rh-negative stock like air traffic controllers tracking planes in a storm. They flag Rh-negative donors, call them back more often, sometimes put them on special registries, not because of a conspiracy, but because the math is brutal. Lose too many Rh-negative units, and certain patients have no chance. That's the surface story. Logical, practical, documented. But in the shadows of that reality, another narrative has been growing. Conspiracy forums, late-night radio shows, obscure blogs from the early days of the internet all whisper versions of the same idea. That governments and private institutions have a special, undisclosed interest in Rh-negative individuals. That the blood bank's urgency is only the public-facing side of a much quieter obsession. Look at the claims, and a pattern emerges. People allege that Rh-negative donors sometimes get VIP treatment without explanation, faster processing, more frequent follow-up, oddly detailed questions about their health and family history. Some say they've been approached about special programs or research projects that aren't clearly explained. Others insist their Rh negative status seems to show up in unrelated paperwork, military files, or medical records where, officially, it shouldn't really matter. Most of this is anecdote. Stories traded in comment sections and long, rambling forum posts. But the sheer volume of them raises a question. Is it all just pattern-seeking in a connected world? Or is there, somewhere behind the bureaucracy, a quiet classification that treats Rh negative blood as something more than just a rare type? Because once you accept that Rh negative is medically valuable, it isn't a huge leap to imagine someone asking, what else could it be valuable for? That's where the stranger theories show up. There are claims, never proven, always deniable, that Rh negative blood has been used in classified research. Experiments on extreme environments, radiation resilience, high-altitude physiology, projects that sound like they came straight out of Cold War science fiction. Think pilots flying higher than commercial jets, submariners spending months in sealed metal shells, astronaut candidates being pushed past the limits of normal endurance. If your job was to find every possible edge, every possible variant of human biology that might perform better in stress, would you test Rh negative people just in case? Some say that already happened. That certain military or intelligence programs quietly screened for Rh factor. Not officially, not on the brochure, but in the back room where the real decisions got made. Then there are the more speculative branches, rumours that Rh negative blood responds differently to certain pathogens, that it might have unusual properties under microgravity, that it behaves oddly in vitro under specific electromagnetic conditions. None of this is supported by mainstream peer-reviewed science. But the idea that somebody, somewhere, might be running those experiments, that's harder to dismiss outright. Human curiosity, especially when backed by defense budgets, rarely leaves a stone unturned. While official institutions remain mostly silent about any special interest beyond transfusion logistics, another phenomenon has exploded out in the open. Rh negative communities. Search the phrase and you'll find them. Forums, social media groups, private networks. Thousands of people scattered around the planet linked not by culture or language, but by an invisible antigen they don't have. They compare notes. My temperature always runs low. Anyone else? Rh negative notice that. I've never needed much sleep. Is that a thing? I get this weird feeling around certain places like I've been there before. Is that just me? People share health patterns, sensitivities, allergies. Some talk about an intense reaction to certain vaccines or medications. Others describe feeling different their whole lives, and only after a routine blood test do they finally have a label for that difference. Out of that stew of experience, myths grow fast, claims of higher intuitive ability, strange coincidences. An unusual number of Rh negatives in certain professions, pilots, nurses, emergency responders, intelligence work. Hard data is scarce. Self-selection and confirmation bias are everywhere. But the conversations themselves are revealing. They show a global population quietly trying to reverse engineer its own identity. Modern genetic testing has only poured more fuel onto that fire. Consumer DNA services promised simple things: ancestry breakdowns, ethnicity estimates, fun facts about your Neanderthal percentage. But people sending off their spit kits started to notice details that didn't fit neatly into the glossy dashboards. Some Rh negative individuals see unexpected clusters of archaic DNA, Neanderthal, Denisovan, or unknown archaic signatures, slightly higher than average for their region. Others find weird statistical outliers in immune system genes, blood traits, or oxygen processing. The reports themselves usually don't say, This is because you're Rh negative. They stick to safe, general language. But for people who already know their Rh status, the temptation to connect dots is overwhelming. Did that rare variant come from some ancient interbreeding event that left behind the Rh negative trait? Why do some Rh negative lineages seem to cluster around old mountain refuges, island populations, border zones where cultures collided for millennia? Is this just geography and chance, or a faded echo of something more deliberate in our past? The genetic companies don't answer those questions. They can't, and maybe they won't. Their public reports are cautious, carefully worded. When anomalies show up, they call them noise, insufficient reference data, or unresolved population structure. But in a world where every scrap of data is monetized, one detail lingers in the background. The raw genetic files these companies collect aren't just used for your ancestry map. They're often licensed, in anonymized form, to pharmaceutical giants, biotech startups, and yes, sometimes government-linked research groups. The official goal: better medicine, better drugs, better understanding of disease. Still, if you step back and look at the bigger picture, a new question emerges. If Rh negative blood is medically precious, if Rh negative genetics contain rare configurations of ancient DNA, if online communities are mapping out patterns in real time that academics haven't fully addressed, what do the institutions holding the largest datasets already know? Hospitals, national blood services, military medical archives, global DNA banks. They sit on oceans of information about blood types, health outcomes, rare variants. When they publish, they show us the tip of the iceberg, trends that are safe, useful, easy to explain. But under the surface, in the raw tables and unreleased correlations, could there be patterns they haven't shared yet? Maybe the answer is entirely ordinary. Maybe Rh negative is just a logistical headache and an evolutionary quirk, nothing more. Or maybe, buried in some restricted access database, there's a quiet notation next to a column labelled Rh factor. A correlation flagged years ago, a pattern someone noticed and then didn't talk about. In the age of satellites, gene sequencers and global networks, the mystery hasn't gone away, it's just moved. Out of stone circles and royal bloodlines, into hospital refrigerators, encrypted servers, and private research labs. We know more about blood than at any point in human history, and yet, with Rh negative, the simplest question still hangs in the air. What exactly are we not being told? For all our technology, for all our gene sequencers and supercomputers, blood still keeps secrets. We've walked through laboratories and legends, maternity wards and myth. We've watched red cells become battlegrounds when an Rh negative mother carries an Rh positive child. We've seen how one tiny protein on the surface of a blood cell can turn pregnancy into a high-stakes negotiation between life and death. That part is solid, testable, repeatable. Medicine depends on it, but then the trail gets blurry. We followed the Rh negative thread into the Basque country, where an isolated people somehow carry some of the highest Rh negative frequencies on Earth. We found it woven through European royal families, whispered about in conspiracies and dynastic charts. We traced it back into stories that shouldn't matter in a modern world, but somehow refuse to die. Nephilim bloodlines, fallen beings, watchers that came down instead of up. We looked at the ancient astronaut hypothesis, and the idea that something non-human might have edited us, leaving a blood type that looks more like a system error than a smooth evolutionary step. We explored Atlantis, not as a confirmed city on any map, but as a symbol of lost civilizations that might have been advanced, organized, and utterly erased, except maybe in the patterns still hiding inside our DNA. Then we turned to mainstream science and asked a simple question. Does any of this prove that Rh-negative blood is alien or angelic or Atlantean? No. What we have are patterns, correlations, and a lot of uncomfortably open questions. We know Rh-negative appears to be a clear genetic mutation. We know it probably arose in a specific population and then spread. We know most explanations involve ordinary evolutionary processes: drift, selection, isolation. We know there are plausible scenarios where Rh-negative confers small survival advantages in certain environments, but we also know that none of those explanations closes the case. They gesture, they sketch possibilities. They don't fully answer why a trait that can literally kill your own offspring under the wrong conditions survived so successfully in some groups and not others. They don't explain the clustering, the odd overlaps with specific regions, lineages, and yes, myths. So the question shifts, not what is the answer, but what kind of thing are we even looking at? Is Rh-negative just another quirk of human variation, no stranger than eye colour or lactose tolerance, dressed up in mystery because we like good stories? Or is it a quiet signal, a reminder that human history, genetic history, is tangled, interrupted, and maybe not as straightforward as the textbook timeline suggests? That's where you come in. What does your blood type say about the journey your ancestors took? About who they met, who they mixed with, what disasters they endured, what refugees they found? Are you Rh-negative? Have you noticed anything unusual about health, perception, family patterns, or just the way people react when they find out? Because beneath all the theories, one thing is certain. Your blood is a record. It remembers migrations you've never heard of, loves and losses that predate writing, catastrophes that shaped continents and cultures and never made it into any history book. It carries echoes of people who survived when they shouldn't have, in places you may never see. Some of that record science can now read. Some of it remains stubbornly opaque, locked behind layers of chance, selection, and time. There are places our tools can't yet reach, places where numbers blur into myth, and myth starts to sound uncomfortably like memory. And that's where the Enigma still lives. If this journey through hidden bloodlines and forbidden possibilities has stirred something in you, stay with it. Don't just stop at this video, ask questions, look up the studies, compare them with the legends, see where they clash and where they quietly line up. And while you're here, add your voice to this investigation. Like this video if it made you think differently about what's flowing through your veins. Subscribe if you want to keep pushing into the shadowed edges of history, where the data runs out and the real questions begin. Drop a comment telling me your blood type, whether you're Rh-negative or positive, and what your own experience has been. Have you felt anything odd about it? Or is it just another medical detail on a form? Most of all, tell me where you're watching from. I want to see, in real time, how this conversation threads across the planet, how people from different countries, cultures, and backgrounds carry their own piece of this ancient code. Because the story of Rh-negative blood isn't finished. It's still being written, in labs and legends, in families and in you. And somewhere, deep in that silent red river moving through your body right now, an answer is waiting. The question is, when we finally understand what your blood has been trying to tell us, will we be ready to hear it?